You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where Emily and I read the Bible and talk about it. Currently we're, what's that look?
I had a gnat. As soon as you started talking, it landed on my nose.
Well,
I don't even know where it came from.
Yeah, and it seems like they wouldn't be around at this timey temperature.
Oklahoma, or maybe that's why they are.
A little, yeah, they might have been driven inside. We're recording on Friday. Oh my gosh, what day is it? The 11th? And March 11th, and there's got to be at least 4 inches of snow on the ground.
We're getting
in
there.
Norman, Oklahoma.
We're getting there outside of Tahlequah.
I was promised less than an inch. Well, I wasn't promised. I mean, the weatherman never actually promised, but I was told less than an inch. And I woke up and Mickey was like, there's a lot of snow on the ground. And I get up and I'm like, this is not less than an inch.
Yeah, as Ty said, those guestiologists don't always get it right. Because it's like it was supposed to be done by now, melting off by now, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get up our mountain to get out of here. So if the video's late, that's why.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, most of our weather detection stuff in Oklahoma is specialized towards tornadoes and whatnot. So I don't know if that affects our ability to predict snow or not.
You can only have one area of emphasis. Everything else is off limits.
but yeah, we can tell you where a tornado is within a like 2 or 3 block accuracy, but
and where it's going to be in 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, I mean, we can, I will say, the meteorologists here do a fantastic job of keeping as many people safe as they can during tornado season.
Absolutely.
Because I tell you, the death tolls here could be significantly higher if we did not have the people working. I mean, there was, and sometimes, this is totally off the path, but, like Oklahoma, we have some serious storms. And there was one year, not too long ago, where it was just rain constantly with storms. And I think we made the national news. That was when the barges broke loose and wound up getting sucked into that dam.
It's like the 30-year flood. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but with that, we had a lot of severe winds and tornadic activity. And there was... the meteorological teams were working, like basically living in the studios, in the radar rooms and whatnot, sleeping there, and it was just nuts. So no, I'll let you say they do a great job. They go above and beyond when it's needed, and so thanks, guys, I guess, if you happen to listen to the show.
So one of the things I have to bring this up, because if you live in Oklahoma, you have your favorite meteorologist, and people are fanatical about their meteorologist because this guy is the one they turn to save their lives. So this is kind of one of the cool things about Oklahoma is those little fan clubs. There's one like Travis Meyer. He's one of the big ones in our area. It's hilarious to see some of the things that they've got him compared to Chuck Norris, and those will be making the rounds again soon because tornado season will be upon us. And I think it's just the Okie sense of humor when you live kind of in constant threat of the winds might actually carry you off. So the water, float you away.
Yeah. Now, in this area, it's in the Oklahoma City area. It's David Payne's the big guy. Before that, it was Gary England. When Gary retired, no one knew what was going to happen. There was a lot of pressure on David, but he's done a pretty good job. So, I mean,
this shows
big shoes to fill.
This shows you just how crazy we are about our meteorologist out here, which is funny because it's not something you expect to. Uh, it's just weird, you know. It just that this is kind of, oh yeah, let's stop and talk about famous meteorologist. That's part of living in Oklahoma. So, but don't
Hmm.
let that scare you off because they are
No,
so
no.
good. You can live safely in Oklahoma.
Yeah, yeah, and for the most part, I mean, most of the tornadoes kind of happen in the same general area, so you kind of just learn where to not buy a house.
Right.
Um, and so that's kind of where that ends up, and you have a storm shelter or a friend with one, and you do the best you can.
Well, see, and that's more your area because out here we don't. You just kind of watch the news. That's about all of it. We don't have a storm shelter, and I know people freak out because oh, you live in Oklahoma and don't have one. No, but I've
Well, it's
seen
about
like
where you live in Oklahoma.
exactly, exactly, and even though there's only like what 2.5 hours between us, it's a big difference.
It is.
It's
Yeah, it's not as big a deal because you got the mountains there to break things
mhm.
up. You're not seeing as many tornadoes.
Yeah, and I
But
think we're down a little valley, so it's just kind of like hop, skip, and jump over us in our new house. So
right, right. And so
that's my theory
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. Well, and over here in Norman, everything is flat. So it's,
And why I don't live in Norman.
I will say we do still get the really heavy hail.
Yeah, y'all probably
Like
get
it
more of that
sounded
too.
like the last big hailstorm sounded like someone was just running across the a like not someone, like many someones running across our roof. But I know that's why everyone's tuning in is because they want the weather
They wanna hear
conditions
about
for
weather.
Oklahoma.
And what's funny is you and I never talk about weather, like, at parties or do small talk about weather, so this is kind of hilarious that
It-
this is, like, the rabbit trail we ended up on.
well, it's because of the snow.
We're
Less
gonna
than
bl
an inch. This is not less than an inch, guys.
no, it's
Um,
not.
this is where my complaints start.
I'm done. I have new flower beds that I want to plant full of flowers and tomatoes and all that good summer stuff, and, yeah, so I'm over it, and
I'm with you.
so
Well, this is like I think the fourth snow we've had here in Norman. So I'm
if I wanted snow, I'd move to Colorado. I don't live in Colorado. I
exactly,
yeah, I was
exactly.
yeah, I'd
So,
move farther south if I thought my husband wouldn't melt, but evidently
so
that's not an option.
I guess I should take note of the timestamp to put it in the show notes to let everyone know when we're done talking about the weather in Oklahoma. So that being said, you've got notes on the Bible, right?
I do, I actually do. So we finished up with chapter 21 last week about David's mighty men. We talked about the contradictions and craziness in that episode. So we're actually going to move forward. Remember, we're working through that chiasm, and we started at both ends, and I'm taking the parallel passages that go together, and then we're working towards the center to see what is that central text to these last four chapters so that we get the point of what the editor's really trying to drive home. And so this means that we're going to skip from the end of 21 over into chapter 23, and this is going to be verses 8 through 39. Um, Now, in 21, like I said, David's mighty men, we were talking about all the giants they killed. And now we're going to talk about David's mighty men again. Now, if you read ahead and you looked at what we're going to be covering, you're probably hoping I don't go through this word by word, phrase by phrase, because honestly, it's just one of those passages that there's some interesting stuff in it, but you kind of have to dig beneath to get to the interesting stuff. Otherwise, it just seems like a list of names, a list of places and ranks. And so we're just going to pick up on some important points because most of the commentary is actually about spelling and typos, and it's not like good theological stuff. And so I think you kind of really have to be a bigger nerd than even I am to really enjoy that. And I think actually most commentators just do it so they can fill the page. So anyway, this list of guys in chapter 23 is primarily made up of guys from the tribe of Judah. And this suggests that it was probably composed early on in David's reign. And additionally, if you look at the names, you're going to find that Asahel, which is Joab's and Abishai's brother, is included. Also, Uriah is included, and they're both dead by this point in the story. So the fact that they're included actually poses some interesting questions, and we'll talk some more about that as we get there. Now, there's a similar list in First Chronicles 11, 10 through 46. And, that list has some variations in it. And this is where a lot of the commentators kind of get lost in the weeds as far as, okay, is this guy, or is that guy that guy? Because the spellings are just off enough that there's a little bit of question, but really not so much that you have to spend a lot of time on it. We already talked about how names changed in an earlier episode and why sometimes there are these variations. So I'm not going to go over that again. What is interesting is the placement in the books, because where a passage is located, particularly in a historical book, it tells you a lot. And
Hmm.
so in Second Samuel, we have this kind of at the end of David's reign. And then in Second Chronicles, we actually have it before David tries to bring the ark into Jerusalem. And so that further supports the idea that this list is from early on in David's reign. And we also have two other lists in the Chronicles which add to that argument, because one of them is people who joined David after he became king. So this list would actually be before he was the king of all of Israel. The
Hmm.
next list would be when he became king of all of Israel. And there's a third list of people who were present when David was anointed at Hebron over all of Israel. So that's another way we look at dating. So when people talk about, oh, well, if they're just looking at the Bible trying to figure this out, then how are they figuring it out? People are just guessing. No, there are pieces of the puzzle that we're looking at. And we're actually, a lot of times, we're looking at pieces of the puzzle that not only do we see, but have been looked at and examined over the ages by multiple sources. I mean, we go back in the Old Testament to the rabbis, we get stuff written down. The Talmud's a great source for that. Whether or not you want to agree with the theology presented in the Talmud, you can still see their commentary on the placement timing of the text. That's still valid. And then you get into the medieval scholarships, and then you get the early church fathers. I mean, there's a wealth of information here. This is not just guesswork.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. Well,
I,
and but yeah, having that commentary, like you said, does help date things, because if you can date a commentary, even if you can't date the
Mhm,
document, you can see that, hey, during this time they were talking about those things,
precisely.
and it's stuff like, you get into the debates about the Book of Enoch, which we know a lot of those are kind of superfluous. And it's,
Yeah.
you look at the New Testament writers, they reference that book.
Hmm.
So it's like, well, it's at least respected enough to be referenced, but and not always refuted by the New Testament writers. So the information in there must be at least somewhat valid.
Yes, and it had to have been written far enough before the New Testament in order to gain that reputation. And you also have to include in there the fact that there's no printing presses. So if somebody read a copy of that book, they got a hold of something someone wrote. And it's
Mhm.
it's not the longest book, but it's a pretty lengthy book.
Sure.
We're going to actually be talking about that later on, because not in this chapter, but I did some work with Enoch, which is kind of interesting, I think. But yeah, so it's definitely there, that you see how the dating kind of it's taking these fragments, these little clues, these bits of information, plugging all the information in. And I will say this, most commentators will tell you something like this book was probably written around this time, sorta. It was approximately these dates, because we can't tell you, June 15th on, 23/7 of, BC. We can't do that. So most commentators are responsible enough not to try to do that. And if someone tries to give you, like, this dead on date for something like that, they're probably making it up, and they probably shouldn't be respected as a credible source. So, just my 2 cents. Now, I mean, you're giving me that look. Just quit overstating things. I mean, that's just one of my pet peeves, is people in faith who try to overstate things in
Yeah.
order to prove a point, because what you wind up doing is you actually wind up lying. So don't do that. That's not helping anyone.
Mhm.
So,
I can't remember what
but
we were talking about that one time. You might remember what example I was using. I can't remember what it was, but when we try to make the Bible a little too miraculous, uh, as it were, uh, and then you go, no, that this was just kind of an idiom that people used. And you're like, oh, okay. It's like
I don't remember.
making language and phrases a little too holy and whatnot.
Well, and really that just ends up in mysticism and magical kind of gibberish. And, the Bible is miraculous, it's not magical. And the difference between that is God is the one who enacts miracles when he chooses, how he chooses, sovereignty. And then the magical is that somehow we can provoke or invoke God to do these things by saying the right words or the right phrase. And, that's just not how it works. And that's hard. I mean, to actually sit back and say, okay, I'm gonna let God be God and do what he wants to do, and to actually be comfortable with it, because a lot of times we're not.
Hmm.
Whether we want to be honest about that or not, y- God gets to do what he wants. And that includes doing things that blow our minds and defy our logic or our understanding. That's okay. It's just one of the perks of being God. So, anyway, um, we'll come back to some more sovereignty issues later. We'll set Nathan off, light his fuse. So anyway, Alter Alter notes that in this passage here in 2 Samuel 23, we have crabbed language, and I'm using some of his quotes because it's Alter. He just has a great way of describing things. Uncharacteristic prose and abundance of textual difficulties. So he sees this as more evidence that this is a very old passage, and, unfortunately, just like a lot of antiques that get worn and used and tossed around and maybe not taken care of and then restored, you're always going to have that evidence of the passage of time. And, textual documents are no different. So he thinks that possibly this could have even been written during David's time. It's not unthinkable because, I mean, after all, David is establishing a royal court. We're now having that governmental system of protection in place that's going to preserve these documents in a way that hasn't happened before. And this is why a lot of stuff written before this list that we have, as far as the whole Bible, tend to be songs, because songs are easy to remember. Now, when you're getting to the more technical stuff, now you need a structured societal system to protect these things. And
Hmm.
so, David's making that. Another interesting element is how the list is written. Alter notes this, that it's not a narrative. It doesn't tell a story. All the way through Samuel, we've been having, it's story time. You tell all this stuff and you get all this explanation, and yeah, I,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
still still
I'm sorry.
relevant.
Sorry. I got. I was thinking of a popular criticism by someone. Story time with Uncle Samuel. Uh,
Right? Well, that's how we do it. I was thinking of the meme, the guy who goes around story time. Anyway, so but Alter doesn't. He notes this, that there's not the story, and the reason why that's important is because when you start like throwing out these big events and you just kind of reference them, basically what you're telling the reader is you should know this. This is just a reminder that this is the guy who did this. And so, we could talk about, Lindbergh, and maybe you don't remember his name, but you remember that that there had to have been a guy who flew across the ocean, or you can toss out these events, and now you're giving the name. So he's just reminding people, hey, this is who did this. So yeah, it's part of your history. Don't forget who to credit with it. And the idea that it's a prompt for the memory, it's not to explain things to people who should already know. Uh, the list is arranged. We go from a highest rank, those closest and to David, those who are the most important, and then we work our way down and out through the troops. And this is actually kind of an interesting thing, because if you read through it, you're going to find this reference to 330 third. There's depends on which translation you reference, because there's a lot of debate on how do we translate this Hebrew word shalashim. Um, we really don't know, and most translations do land on 3, just as the number 3. And, the context usually tells us how we should translate this, whether it should be 3, 30, or third. Unfortunately, um, we're dealing with pretty much an unknown context because we're talking about military language, we're talking about a military list, and military, the arrangement and the way their structures varies not only from country to country, but from army to army, which branch we're talking about. So it's hard to pull examples to say, okay, this is exactly what they're speaking of. Um, another way that we work on translation is to look at background information. We don't have a lot of background information. The top 3 guys on this list, this is the only places they're mentioned are in these kinds of lists. So we can't say, oh, okay, well, this is where he ranked within David's army. So it's kind of difficult to say exactly how this should be translated and interpreted. Um, now, when you consider like the first guy, we're just going to look at him. He's got this wonderfully long name, Jeshebasheth. Um, he's the chief of 3. And Zamora offers this is how many options Zamora considers in his commentary. So just hang on because there's several. So it says that he is chief of 3. So we're looking at that word chief. What does that mean? Is that a general? Would that be an admiral? At what rank would we place him at? We really don't know. So these are the options. One who stood immediately next to the king and was commander of the army. Okay, sounds reasonable. Officers of the 3rd rank below the king and commander of the army. So got 2 different positions there. The 3rd man in a chariot, a special group of warriors whose original distinction had been that they fought in 3-man squads. That's similar to the Ugaritic word for metal. Therefore, it's referring to someone who wears armor. That this is actually a description of a fighting style that mirrors Pharaoh's charioteers. The 3rd ranking officials, like the Greeks in the original hometowns of the Philistines. So pick one. There's a lot of options. That's how kind of hazy this idea of 3 is. One thing that is clear that inclusion in this list really requires almost this supernatural feat of bravery and courage. Um, so that is common to everyone. And we got to remember if these guys were fighting giants and they are all equal to the task, it's these are pretty impressive guys. This is not just a group of warriors who were, could shoot an arrow straight or could throw the spear the farthest. This is hand-to-hand combat with giants. And we need
Which,
to remember.
which we just watched the first part of Princess Bride last night, so I'm
Oh,
thinking of Wesley now. uh,
would he been among the mighty men?
he bested a giant.
Well, and that's one of the arguments too that's out there, which I actually just don't think makes a lot of sense. A lot of people who are giants today have a pituitary issue
Mhm.
that causes them to grow abnormally tall, but it also causes heart issues. It causes balance issues. It causes a number of health problems. It doesn't make them particularly uh, intimidating foes.
Yeah, well, and actually that was who is it? What's his Malcolm Gladwell has a and I think we mention this during the Goliath stuff or not? I don't remember.
I don't
But
remember.
he has a talk about it, how if the biblical proportions are correct, it is possible that Goliath had some kind of pituitary issue, which would also commonly affect sight.
Hmm.
Because in the story, he tells David, say, like, "Come here so I can see you."
Hmm. Hmm.
So we're looking at someone, David fighting with artillery at a distance safe enough to get somebody with poor vision. Uh,
Well,
so that's uh, that was I thought that was interesting, but I don't know
it's
exactly the
it's an
accuracy on it.
interesting thought. Here's the reason why I can't completely buy into at least the totality of his argument. The giants were feared and they were seen as intimidating, and so evidently they weren't just kind of bumbling oafs who couldn't fight, they actually were considered to be formidable adversaries.
Hmm.
So, could they, do they have vision problems? Possibly, but it's still, if you had to get up and fight them, it wasn't like you could shoot them with a sniper rifle at this point in time. And yeah, a sling would allow you to get some distance from them, but it seems that there's actually more going on face to face with these guys than just what David did. And the other thing to remember about these guys too is they're all fighting on behalf of the Lord. Um, if Israel, as the Torah says, belongs to God, then anyone who is fighting in defense of Israel is actually fighting as an act of obedience and faith. And so, huge point there, because when you notice that it talks about who wins and how they win, that it's because God fought for them or God fought with them. And so God works victory for them. And that's a really huge point in this, is that these guys aren't just out there trying to show off who can be the manliest man. They are actually trying to defend God's territory for the purpose of keeping Israel safe, the people within the country, the women, the children, those who can't fight for themselves, against armies of giants. You know, I think we sometimes forget that this is not some kind of hypothetical. And for us, maybe what's going on with the events with Russia and Ukraine are kind of making it more real to us now, that there is, war has an impact on people, real people. It's not
Yeah.
something that just happens on a screen. It damages the societies that it impacts. And so, this is the reality for ancient Israel, that war, yes, it wasn't being fought with planes and tanks, but when you're the person whose house is being invaded, then it doesn't matter what they're using to invade it with. You want it to stop. You need it to stop for the safety of your family and loved ones. So these heroic deeds, they're not just people showing off. They're not acts of aggressions. These are Philistines who are coming into Israel to attack. And we really can't we don't have a place within the narrative of Samuel to try to place these with any kind of certainty. There's a few that we might have some idea, but overall, we just have these kind of just these little snippets thrown out without any place to really plug them in. Now, the first man on the list, as I did mention earlier, has that great long name, Joshebasheth. Jo Joshebashebeth. Somebody needs to name their kid that. Okay, so there's no speculation at all when he single-handedly killed 800 men. Okay, that's pretty doggone impressive no matter who you are. This is another one of those situations, we talked about it in a previous passage. You can go back and listen to it, where they believe because this is such an intimidating, great feat, and David is the hero of the story, that this has to be another name for David. Um, you know, I still have problems with that theory. It is interesting, and it reveals a lot about the rabbis trying to elevate David. I mean, David is kind of the epitome of what they wanted the ruler of Israel to be like. And, Israel under the reign of David and Solomon, that was considered to be Israel's golden age. So, you kind of get the hero worship there, but don't overstate the Bible. Now, if you read through the list, and I think even if you haven't, you would really expect to see a name that's not here. The name that's not in the list, you wanna take a jab at it to figure out who it is?
Joab?
Yeah, I gave you a nice little hint there. Do you like that? So yeah, Joab, he's missing completely. I mean, why isn't he included in David's mighty men? I mean, he has been at David's side. He has defended David against outside threats. He's defended David against himself. He's defended David against David's family. Joab has been there all the way along, and we do have the inclusion of Joab's two brothers. So why is he not there? Um, he's
My
not there on
first
the
gue
list.
my
Go
first
ahead.
guess is that because he outranks them all.
That's actually a very good guess, and that is one of the things that the rabbi said, that Joab is so far above everyone that to include him on this list would actually be demeaning. So that is one option. Another option is that this guy, this first guy with the long name, even going to wrestle with again, might be another name for Joab, and I would actually kind of buy that more than David. I would think if we're going to talk about David, we're going to use David's real name. So, but yes, Joab is conspicuous in his absence. But that tells you something about the type of men we're dealing with. If Joab's not there for either reason, either Joab is like crazy insane that he's so far above a warrior who single-handedly kills 800 men, or this is Joab. This is the kind of warriors we're dealing with. We're not talking about regular warriors by any stretch of the imagination. Eleazar, he's the second on the list. He's one of the warriors who stood with David when the armies of Israel fled before the Philistines. So everybody else runs away in fear. David and Eleazar stays, and he fought until his hand froze on the sword. His muscles cramped up and were so locked into that sword that he literally could not release the sword for a while. And it says all that was left in his wake were just bodies ready to be stripped for plunder, which we know this is standard practice at this point in time.
Hmm.
If you killed somebody, you got to take what they had. Because manufacturing replacement goods was not easy. So if you could grab a sword, grab a piece of armor, you used it
Yeah.
because that's how you
Everybody
survived.
everybody likes free stuff, right?
Right? It's amazing how many things don't change over the years, or they're just all related to us. I don't know. So Shammah, another person on the list, he defends a patch of lentils. Now, I mean, come on, in today's society, that sounds like something crazy because, I mean, lentils, get grief. No, this was like a main form of food. They're still eating a lot in the Middle East country
Hmm.
regions. And we know that this is standard practice. What did the Philistines do? We talked about this with Gideon and other, was Gideon who fought the Philistines? Anyway, whoever he fought. Standard practice. Come in when it's harvest season and they're going to destroy the harvest.
Yeah.
And so
Take what you can, destroy the rest.
exactly. So you accomplish two things. You get to feed your people and you get to starve the enemies out. And so Shammah uh, actually protected this patch of lentils and he's remembered for that. Why? Because it meant that the city probably got to survive. I'm sorry for the bumping on the video here. Gus has decided that he needs my attention for whatever reason. Uh,
Gus is
so
the cat, for
he's
those of
like
you who have not.
rubbing around my legs. Yes. So anyhow, he'll get bored and leave here in a second. Verse 13 through 17, we have a little hint of a narrative. Again, we're not given any kind of placement or idea of where this goes. This tells the story of when David's pinned down with 30 of his men. The Philistines are encamped in the valley of the Rephaim. And because of this, some of the commentators think that we should place this event sometime around 2 Samuel 5, 17 through 25. However, they're also in the cave of Adullam, which suggests that David was fleeing from Saul. So that would be 1 Samuel 22. So you see where we kind of have this problem with the dating. You know, obviously more than one battle is going to happen in the Valley of the Rephaim. The bottoms of valleys make great places to have battles. They're relatively flat. You can kind of engage the enemy better there. If you've got a good hiding spot and it worked well once, why not use it again if it's, so there's no reason not to think that David would return to the cave. I don't know when to place this, and I'm not going to try to suggest that I do. Um, but while they're there, David muses aloud that it would be really great to have some water from the well at Bethlehem, the city where he grew up in. And, uh, you know, three of his men, they hear this. David, this is not a command. Okay, let's be very clear about this. David's he's in dire straits. He wants something comforting from home. He's probably thirsty, hot, and tired. They've been fighting. And he's like, that would be really good right now, like you tend to do. And not that I've ever been trapped in a cave, but there's been those moments where just something from home would be nice. And three of these guys, they leave, they sneak past the Philistine guards, they get to Bethlehem, and they get some water and they bring it back to David. And David, whenever he gets the water, he he recognizes the jeopardy that his men place themselves in just to make him happy, just to bring him this bit of comfort. And he decides that he cannot drink the water. I mean, that's just too much. And so, as it's the most precious thing in his possession at this point in time, David pours it out as a drink offering to God, and he willingly gives it up. And it's really interesting because I don't have it in my notes, but one of the commentators said that I think it was one of the rabbis who said that David valued this water as he would the blood, that it had the same value as the blood of the men who risked their lives for it, and so he couldn't drink it because of that.
Mhm.
And so, and then, of course, what do you spell out for a sacrifice? And then, of course, and I won't go into all the possibilities, but then the rabbis go into this big long speculation of, well, you can't make an offering if you're not at the temple or the tabernacle. And so, did David offer this at the proper place? And was there an altar in the cave? Was it right to build an altar in the cave, or did he hang on to it until they left the cave? Or, I mean, just this, all this speculation on stuff that really
Mhm.
doesn't matter. The point is, David didn't drink the water at the time. But what this really does, it does demonstrate the level of commitment and loyalty David inspired. And I mean, that's very telling that if him as a leader if he is a leader, sometimes my Okie slips out. If he as a leader could just muse aloud and say, "Hey, I want this water. That would be great." And his guys like literally put their lives on the line to fulfill a whim. That's huge. It wasn't like he needed it to live. This was just a whim. It was, just a passing thought. I grumble if my husband says, "Hey, go get me a glass of water out of the kitchen," and I've got to walk across the room. This but David was able to actually, just compel this kind of devotion from these guys that they were willing to risk everything for just to bring him a little bit of happiness.
Mhm.
And I think we forget that that had to be something that was innate in David. I mean, yeah, we like him because we know he's a biblical hero, but trying to imagine like actually interacting with him, trying to imagine what it would be like to be in his presence, that people would respond to him the way that they do. That's not normal.
Right.
So the next person on the list, we know this name. This is Abishai. He is Joab's brother. David put him over his army at one point in time whenever Sheba was in the rebellion. We're told he's a chief over 30 men. Um, we know that he has this fierce and loyal devotion to David. We're told in this passage that he's killed 300 men, and he earns a name beside the three, but he did not attain the three. So think about that for a second. Abishai, as amazing as he was, as crazy as some of his exploits were, he's still not as great as the three greatest warriors in David's army. These guys were like the ultimate fighting force, and I don't think we realize that so often, that they are really doing just crazy things out there on the battlefield. Benaniah, he is the doer of great deeds. He We don't really know what some of those great deeds are other than what's told here, but the fact that he's called this in light of what we've just heard, 800, 300 men. I mean, the guys who went and risked their life for some water. This is crazy. We're told that he strikes down two Ariels of Moab. Now, we don't know what these are. Ariel means lion of God in Hebrew, but why would Moab have this Ariel? We There's some confusion here, okay? Nobody has a good answer. I think probably one of the best probabilities is that this is some kind of cultic object or objects that are being used as some kind of, maybe an image of a lion that's being used to worship. We don't know, but he fights. He strikes them down, and he's remembered for this. And we do know that whenever the warriors destroy cultic objects, this is something worthy of being praised for within the Samuel narrative. He also fights a giant. Now, here in Samuel, we only know that he fights an Egyptian, but if you go over to First Chronicles 11:23, we're told this Egyptian is 7.5 feet tall. And we're also told that his spear is like a weaver's beam.
Hmm.
So definitely a giant. What is interesting, we have absolutely no mention of any kind of conflict between Israel and Egypt during David's reign. So why would he kill an Egyptian? Most probably because this is a mercenary soldier who hired out. Hey, he's a big guy. He can throw a spear that's like a weaver's beam. He's going to go make some money. This is typical standard practice in all of history. We know this. Um, a few other interesting things about Benaniah that we've gleaned from Chronicles is that his father's the chief priest, so he's a
Mhm.
Levite.
Mhm.
Levites are known for being fierce. This is how they became the chosen ones to defend the tabernacle. He's head of David's bodyguards, and he will become the commander over Solomon's army. So, I mean, this guy's no slouch. And as impressive as he is, the three are still more impressive than him. So, next name on the list is Essachel, who is killed by Abner, and we remember him from the first part of Second Samuel. He's part of the 30. Remember, he's Joab and Abishai's brother, and he's really kind of the last name of interest for a moment. But we'll come back to, of course, the last name on the list, which is of interest. But overall, the list reveals an interesting blend of people. So we have 3 from the tribe of Benjamin, we have 2 from Manasseh, we have 2 from Ephraim, we have 3 from Dan, 1 from Gad, an Ammonite, a Hittite, and maybe 1 from Makkah if one of the ones from Dan really was from Makkah instead of Dan. Um,
Okay.
y- well, I mean, what it does, it shows that even though the most of them were from Judah, David was gathering people from all around. That it's not just confined to Judah. And if this is early in his reign, that's really big, because especially the 3 Benjaminites, considering that Saul, before David takes the throne, is the king, and what's Saul's tribe? It's Benjamin. Um, Now, one of the problems with some of the cities, there's cities of several different names. Makkah, we've got a couple of different Makkahs, just like we got a couple of different the cities named Paris. I
Sure.
mean, if somebody from Oklahoma tells you that they took a trip to Paris, they probably went to Paris, Texas. So, anyhow, we've got this list, and we're told at the end of the list that there were 37 in all. Now, anybody who can count automatically knows that this is incorrect. There's not 37 names. Um, the only way you get 37 is if you add Joab to the mix. And we all know that Joab should be on the list, but he's not. So there is this idea that maybe Joab was taken off the list later on, because when we get into David's death, over in First Kings, we find out one of the things that David does is command that Solomon actually kill Joab for evils that David felt had been done by Joab. So, the other thing to note about this list in particular is Uriah's name is the last name on the list. It's very conspicuous in the fact that it's the last name on the list. You've got all these great, you know, daring acts of courage, and then Uriah. And the writer is being very intentional. He wants you to remember that as great and as wonderful as David is, the guy he killed was just as impressive as all these other guys. Don't forget Uriah. I
Mhm.
Because when you think about the fact that Uriah the Hittite was fighting for Israel, the guy is fighting to defend God's country. I mean, he deserves to be remembered. And so, if you go over to First Chronicles and read read their list over there, you're going to find there's 16 names, additional names after Uriah. It doesn't stop there. So Chronicles, they include Uriah, but they kind of hide him in the masses, if you will. He just becomes another name on the list. Where here in Samuel is kind of like a slap in the face. Don't forget Uriah.
Sure.
It's to me. I mean, like I said, this is kind of one of those things that even after I studied it, it was still just a list of names. But at the same time, it was really good to stop and think about what it meant to be a warrior in David's army. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we have this list of his mighty men. It wasn't all that uncommon, but it wasn't super common for kings to list all of their warriors. But one of the reasons is that the list could actually say, hey, if these guys who were this great and so, courageous and so daring were willing to follow David, that tells you how great of a king and a person he was. Because only a great person could inspire this from such great warriors. Um, the second reason that it could be included is that to remind us, David didn't do all this on his own. And, when David's fleeing from Saul, remember, we got 400 guys following David around when he's fleeing from Saul. So David was never on his own. And he always had people on his side and helping him out. And I think too often we think, oh, it's just David. We've got kind of that image of David standing on that field approaching Goliath in our minds. And we never stop and tweak that and realize that there comes a point where he really is relying on the ability of these men who surround him. And so it can elevate David from the standpoint that, yes, he does inspire this kind of devotion, but it's also kind of brings him back to earth a little bit, that he wasn't, so great that he didn't need help. And so we also have this really interesting thing where, because of what we saw in the earlier chapter back in 21, David, he's not the only giant killer.
Hmm.
He is surrounded by these other men who are capable of doing exactly what he did. And so, as impressive as his military exploits are, in many ways, there's not as much as special about David as you might expect there to be. I mean, God could have chosen any one of these other guys and appointed him, anointed him king over Israel. So, on one hand, we should really be in awe of Israel, who, this country that has these amazing warriors and all of these mighty men who are willing to defend her. But on the other hand, we should be asking ourselves, why David?
Hmm.
Why is he the one that God chose? When, I mean, obviously, I mean, that's kind of how. Sorry about Gus. That's kind of how the story of David opens up. Samuel goes in to anoint the king, and he sees David's brothers, and he's ready to anoint the first brother he sees because he's far more impressive
Hmm.
than David. And so it's very fitting that David's story concludes with this reminder that he's not the only one who can kill a giant. He's not the only one capable of all of these things. So that's really all I have to say about our list of mighty men. Uh, there, it's kind of a crazy story because I don't think we often remember that this is not a solo endeavor by David,
Right.
and how much he really relies on other people to help him through this. But anyhow, moving on. We're in Psalm 22 is where we're getting right. I'm sorry, 2 Samuel 22, which is a psalm. It's just plopped right in the middle of the story. All we're told about it is that it's David's psalm of deliverance. And we have a lot of psalms that are attributed to David, and this is one of 13 of those psalms that is specifically attributed to David and connected to specific events in David's life. But there aren't a lot of psalms in the narrative themselves. So when you see something that's kind of not normal, kind of unusual, you need to ask, why here? Why now? Why this?
Right.
And And a lot of times that's all we need to do. Uh, Evidently, my cat decided to die today. I don't know. I mean, he not literally die. He just thinks he is because I'm not paying attention to him.
It's cold outside. He does. He's
Yeah,
bored.
he really is. He probably knows that the bird feeders are like loaded, and he probably wants to go stalk them, and he knows I don't let that happen. So anyhow, so we have this suggestion by Arbanel. We've talked about him. He's one of the famous sages with commentary on the Old Testament. And it's as good as any, honestly. It, Sometimes when you read this rabbinic and sage, the commentary of the sages, and even the medieval commentators, they aren't any different than what you're going to find in today's commentaries. Sometimes they're radically different, but that's the reason why you kind of got to use some judgment and discernment to figure out who you need to listen to. Just because someone's talking about the Bible doesn't mean that they are correct. So, so Arbanel says that David's other psalms are connected to an isolated event in his life, but this one refers to a general theme of overcoming an adversity throughout David's life. So, um, this one is kind of encompassing the whole of his life instead of just a specific event. And that's the reason why we've got it here, is because now we're wrapping up David's reign. We're getting to the end of David's story, because the next chapter is David's last words. And First King is going to open up with David's death, the specific events surrounding David's death. And this plays into the next question we have to ask. But first, let me give you all some setup. So, First Samuel 22 and Psalm 18 are essentially the same psalm. And the thing is, even though they're essentially the same psalm, there are several differences. Mostly, it's the spelling, which you as an English reader, most of our listeners as English readers are never going to notice, because those spelling changes don't translate over into the English.
hmm
We have a few lines where their order is swapped. Some of our verb tenses between the two are different. Sometimes the subject and adjective pairings are switched up. So, in order to notice these differences, basically what I'm saying is you're having to be super geeky and nitpicky. And honestly, most people aren't going to notice it because they are so close. So our question is, why do we have the differences? So, few different options here. First, First Samuel 22 is part of the narrative, and it would have been meant to be read out loud. And so the spellings in this passage tend to actually be more phonetic. So if you're reading a passage out loud in front of an audience, you wouldn't stumble over the words like I tend to do. It'd just be easier. It could roll off the tongue. Psalm 18 is a songbook. And so, it's meant to be used in regular worship. And so the spelling is more what is considered a standardized spelling for the Hebrew. It's what the audience would be used to reading if they read on a day to day basis. Um, so, you know, even in English, we know that there's words that if you pronounce them phonetically versus how the standard spelling is, there's a difference. There's we can't always go by spelling to get the proper phonetics. And so in Psalm 18, we have the standardized spelling that people should know. In 2 Samuel 22, we have the phonetic spelling because we're dealing with two different usages here. Now, Second Samuel, obviously, this is an expression of David's individual experience. This is what he sees, how he sees what he has lived through. And this is what he considers to be a proper response. Psalm 18 has a more universal application because it's meant for anyone to be able to sing and anyone to be able to relate to, which is what you want in a worship song, even today.
hmm
So that uh, there's several reasons, and they all make sense, and they all really help us understand a little better. Now, the traditional Jewish view is that David first wrote this under inspiration to express his own experience, but then God later inspired him to modify the book in order to turn it into a psalm that the entire nation could use. I don't know. We might kind of, sort of could go that way. I really think probably what happened was when the compilers of the Psalms started looking at what they were going to include, they said, hey, this would work, but we just need to kind of change some adverbs here and there. And they they made it more universal. That happens.
Mhm.
I and so every commentator I've read did agree that 2 Samuel 22 is most definitely older than the Psalm, and it does look like it dates back to the time period when we would expect David to be writing. So it's one of our oldest Psalms, which is really fascinating that we can actually look at something that was written as, 10th century BC. I mean, that's crazy.
Mhm.
So anyway, um, that it's the longest psalm, one of the longer psalms, sorry, but it's the longest statement made by David. It's considered to be one of the 10 sacred songs that's going to be sang when the Messiah arrives. And bonus, it gives us a chiasm within a chiasm because the psalm itself is a chiasm.
Mhm.
So, of course, we're going to talk about that, but we're going to go straight through the psalm and then talk about the chiasm later. Um, the the psalm is at this point typical ancient Hebrew literature. It's a commentary on the life of a king, and we should be familiar that a lot of times at the end of books, or at least two other times at the end of books within the Bible, when our main character, one of our main characters dies, he's given a song to sing. Um, Go back to Genesis where Jacob dies. What's he do? He gives that the psalm, the blessing, the song over his sons. And then Deuteronomy 32, Moses, same thing. We're laughing.
I'm thinking of operas and a
Oh,
particular song about an opera. So
okay.
that's,
Okay. Well, well, yeah, no,
I'll fill you in later.
there's this nice little, there's this tradition where if you're going to die, you've got to leave your last words. And how do you do it? You do it in a way that's memorable, and especially if those last words are meant to teach some theological lesson. I mean, and usually, like in more popular works, it's not necessarily theology, but there's supposed to be some life lessons, some wisdom that was earned throughout this person's life. And so we definitely see that as something that's ongoing today. And so David is going to give us what he's learned in the psalm because we need to know this. And now, this is not his last words, but it's next to the last words, because what we're going to find out is the next chapter is actually considered to be his last words, even though his death doesn't happen until the next book. And this is actually something that connects him back to Abraham, because if you look at Abraham's story, it also has kind of those two endings.
Yeah,
And
and
so
Joshua.
Joshua, yeah, so this idea that there's like this acknowledgement you're going to die, but then there's the actual death, and it's in that moment of acknowledging the death that people actually kind of have these profound thoughts that they need to share. And you know this is why we have this song here at the end of Samuel, because now we need to talk about David's life as a whole, and we need him to really kind of stop and take stock. And I think we're going to be surprised at some of the observations that David makes about himself in this psalm, because there's some things in here that if just taken at surface level, if we aren't taking into account all of the things within David's life and the truth of who God is and God's forgiving love and his mercy, it's going to look like David's just telling lies about himself.
Mhm.
I mean, and I know that that sounds kind of harsh that I would say something like that, but David is actually making some theological statements. And here's how I kind of like make the delineation. We have truth and we have facts. And truth is the world and reality as God sees it. It's how things are going to be. It's how he intends for things to be. It's how he's going to bring all things to be at some point in the future, probably. Then there's facts, and facts are the nitty gritty day to day things that you and I deal with. You know, an example: my father owns the cattle of 1,000 hills. This is my God. He's rich. He's prosperous. There's wealth beyond measure in his presence and at his disposal. Sometimes I'm counting pennies to make ends meet. So truth is, I'm a princess in the kingdom of God who has no reason to worry or fear about being taken care of. The facts are, I still have to be a responsible adult and watch my budget. And so truth and facts don't always line up well in this reality, but that's the great thing is God is working towards that happening. That's what history is building towards is that moment when truth and facts do line up.
Mhm.
And I really do think that the moments in our lives when we see truth and facts lined up is when we what we call a miracle. It's when the truth of what God sees and says about us actually is manifest in this world. And so David is looking at this not from the perspective of facts. He's looking at this from the perspective of truth and God's truths. And so that's significant. And I think sometimes, we need to take this page from David where we look at our lives and go, okay, yes, I did sin horribly, and I'm not, not downplay that, but there is forgiveness and there is grace and there's hope on the other side. And as I move forward, I need to embrace what God has said about me, not what I did in the past, because my past no
Mhm.
longer define me. I'm born new. I've been made new. I've been cleaned. All of this stuff is so true. And I think so often um, we put this emphasis of, well, we fall into one of two ditches where we're either walking around so condemned and so incapable of functioning because we're having to face the fact that we are sinners who have sinned and, maybe we've done some terrible things, or, oh, we're free in the Lord and I never have to think about that again. We don't get to do that.
Mhm.
We've got to stay in the middle where we recognize and we own what we've done in the past, not as a way to beat ourselves up, but as a way to say, I know I'm capable of this, so I need to have safeguards in place to keep me from doing that again and to make sure that I'm walking in the truth of who God says I am. But who God says I am doesn't give me carte blanche authority to do whatever I want to do just because God doesn't, hold it against me anymore.
Mhm.
So had Paul put it, should I sin more so that grace will abound? No, we don't do that. So
Right.
David's found that balance, I think, by the time, maybe not the beginning of his reign, certainly not when he's with Bathsheba, but then there's that point of time towards the end of his life where he's able to look back with some, well-earned wisdom and say, this is how I need to be viewing myself. And this is the truth I need to be embracing about my existence and my reality. So, I think we're going to put a semicolon there and we can get back to the meat of that psalm next week. But that's a good setup to kind of be thinking about how we should move forward into these words and consider them
Yeah. It's gonna,
because
yeah. It's gonna be kind of an interesting break from what we've been doing too, where we've been so much in narrative and lists and
mhm.
things. This is gonna be kind of mixing it up.
Yeah, well, and this is a really long psalm, but it's so good because it actually in all four of these chapters, one of the things I've noticed there's this tendency to like go full circle to bring us
Mhm.
back to the beginning of the book,
Right.
and this psalm does that again, and so there's this reinforcement of redeeming everything. So anyway, before I get started talking longer on something we've decided to hold off on, I'll
Sure.
let you do our wrap up.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. That's a good place. Yeah. We're excited to see next week, and we hope everyone out there is interested. Let's be part of the conversation. If you want to be part of the conversation, Raven Creek SC on all the social media, ravencreeksc.com is where you can find the show with show notes. On most of the shows, we're still working through some of that. You can find other shows as well uh, that Raven Creek host. But be part of the conversation. Send us a message. Let us know how things are going. And we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to join us next week.
This is the Open Wallet Podcast, an exploration of personal finance. I'm Katie, a numbers nerd.
And I'm Joe, a 40-year-old punk rocker.
And we're married.
We're here to talk about and figure out all the personal finance questions we all deal with, like,
How do I read my pay stub?
how do I dress better on a budget?
How do I start an emergency fund?
What goes into buying a house?
And lots more.
So join us on Open Wallet Podcast, on iTunes or wherever you find podcasts.